So as we've started the Power Shift project, and we've been in workplaces and we've talked to lots of people, we've heard from very caring, well-meaning men, women, people who believe they have some privilege and power and they want to help, but they want to do it right. They don't want to offend people even as they're trying to be supportive. Let me give you an example. As we talk about workplace integrity, which I remind you is environments free of harassment, discrimination, and incivility, but filled with opportunity, especially for those who've been denied it, we've learned that workplace integrity is an achievable goal, that it has to be embedded in organizational values, systems, and culture. It does require the continuing and visible commitment of leaders, and allies matter at every level. So what do we mean by this quest to become an ally? Well, we've learned that just as you can't just say you're a leader, people have to choose to follow you. You're not an ally unless people believe you qualify. You can't just come up and say, hello, I'm an ally, any more than you can say, hi, I'm a leader. It's the opinion of others. But it matters to people. I want to share a question that came to me during a Q&A Power Shift session that I was doing with managers, general managers from public radio, and this question came into us. The man said, men I talk to feel strongly that the treatment of women and others that's come to light is so wrong. We're saddened and abhorred by it, too, but we don't know the rules for expressing this. Because of our gender, men seem to feel either that we don't have the right to speak, or we're the gender who's at the core of this by guilt by association, or we don't want to be perceived as above it all, or that our voices have been dominant for so long that we just need to be quiet now. We want to be full participants in the conversation and the solution. What advice do you have? That gives you a sense of how caring people do want to make a difference, but don't want to do it wrong. So what advice do we have? Well, one of the things I'll tell you is you've got to listen to learn. And that's what we did at the Power Shift. Diverse voices and views are going to inform everything I tell you today. Whose voices? Well, we brought together media organizations from the International Women's Media Foundation, Women's Media Center, National Women's Law Center, EEOC, JAWS, National Gay and Lesbian Journalists Association, Black journalists, Asian American journalists, Hispanic journalists, South Asian journalists, Native American journalists, the Maynard Institute, the National Center on Journalism and Disability, the Chip Squin Scholars, and they are young, up-and-coming journalists of color who are supported by the Freedom Forum Institute. And then journalists in diversity and inclusion programs in the US and Canada. We've been listening. And what we're about to share with you is advice from all of these diverse voices who want you to know that if you want to be an ally, it's not about you. It's about lifting and elevating other people. If you want to be an ally, don't think of yourself as a hero. Think of yourself as a helper. So here, we're going to share with you 10 of many ways that you can be seen to qualify as an ally. So number one, understand that power affects our perspectives. Everything I'm about to share with you is from research, often from the American Psychological Association, Pew Center, Gallup Research, and others. And here are some points from research. Managers overestimate workplace morale, engagement, and opportunities. It's what we do as managers. We think things are better than they are. Whites are far less likely than minorities to believe that race holds people back in the workplace. Whites are less likely than minorities to support affirmative action for minorities. Men are less likely than women to view workplace sexual harassment as a major problem. Men are less likely than women to support affirmative action for women. Men are more likely than women to believe their workplace is making progress in gender diversity, and men overestimate their own roles in the perceived success. How about this? This is from the Human Rights Coalition. Half of non-LGBTQ workers say they don't think there are LGBTQ workers in their workplace. Meanwhile, nearly half of LGBTQ workers report being closeted at work. They fear stereotyping and loss of connections and relationships. You see the disconnect? You see how if you've got power, you just see things a little differently. There's also research that tells us that power can diminish our capacity for empathy. And allies need to empathize. So if we've tuned ourselves up to be empathetic, to know that our power, if we have it, gives us a blind spot, and that we have to tune up our empathy, let's keep learning. So number 2, recognize the realities and risks of unconscious bias. You've heard this term, and it's almost offensive to hear someone say you've got bias, right? Because you don't wake up in the morning thinking, who am I going to discriminate against today? So you get kind of uncomfortable when someone wants to talk about it. Oh, is this going to be petty? Is this going to be blaming? Well, just open your mind for a second. Defensiveness is only going to create barriers. It isn't about guilt. It's about vigilance. So what does unconscious bias actually look like? The realities of it are sort of reflexive stereotyping. If you've had a few experiences in your life with a bad female boss, you begin to tell stories about bad female bosses, and they seem larger in life than they may really exist statistically. Automatic assumptions. There may be an assumption on your part about how people should behave. Women are often told, for example, that in negotiations, they are more likely to take the first offer, right? And so they should ask for a second amount, ask for more the way men do. But research says that because of unconscious bias, when women do it, they may look greedy. Now, why is that? It's probably because we were raised by parents, maybe mom, who said, go ahead, you take the last piece of chicken, dear. It's all right, you do it. And we assume that women are self-sacrificing. And so when a woman asks for more, it looks selfish. If a man asks for more, it may look powerful. Those assumptions that we have need to be challenged. You may have instinctive reactions to what scares you because of some experience in your life. You may overestimate or underestimate someone's ability. You may just avoid what's unfamiliar. I don't want to go there. It's too hard to have these conversations or to change the way we do things because, if it works, let's just stick with it. And you may just trust your gut to a fault. Because oftentimes someone says, my gut tells me that this person isn't a good fit for us. But what is your gut comprised of? A bad experience in the past? A rumor that you heard? A lesson that you heard on somebody's knee when you were a kid? Your gut may be right, but if you cannot provide more than just a gut feeling when you are making a decision about someone's future, your gut could be wrong, and that could be unconscious bias. So all you have to do is work a little harder to define what your gut is telling you, whether it's based on data or what you still need to know to be able to tell someone with real conviction more than a supposition. Because if we don't, the realities and risks end up with inequities and errors in the way that we recruit, thinking who would be interested in this job or who would be competent for it, how we hire, how we provide feedback. There are managers who actually hesitate to give feedback to people who are in the minority in their organization. They may not want to look like they're biased. And then annual evaluations come around and someone is stunned to find out that their performance isn't seen as adequate. The way we evaluate people, if we don't evaluate people on the same kind of basis, if I'm an extrovert, I may evaluate introverts as non-team players because of my unconscious bias of thinking that I'm an extrovert and, wow, people have to come and ask me for the job. I have actually worked with managers who have said to me, I will never give a job to a person who doesn't come in here and fight for it. That's the way the manager got the job. But what if your employee has been raised in a culture in which they were told, let your work speak for itself. Keep your head down, do a good job. Don't break your arm patting yourself on the back. You're doing what you think is the right thing. You've got a boss who says, you better come in and fight for it. And those are unspoken rules and unconscious bias. Negotiations, as I explained to you how some of our employees can be at a disadvantage. Pay. I've come up in a time where I actually had a boss who said, well, that guy makes good money for a single guy. And some people still have that mindset. Do married people deserve more? Do people who are supporting others deserve more? Do men deserve more than women? We think on paper we've got this down. But there is unconscious bias of somebody who tells you, oh, they want to buy a house, and suddenly that's in the back of your mind when you're making those decisions about whether this person gets this percent or that percent. And you've got to constantly say to yourself, what are the core values I have to apply? What about promotions? What does paying your dues really look like? Conflict resolution. You heard a previous reference to the idea of some people being more threatening than others by people's unconscious bias. If I'm a woman of color and I raise my voice to you, am I an angry black woman or an angry Hispanic woman differently than if I'm Jill Geisler, blonde woman, who raises my voice to you? Are you going to accept it the same? Are you going to accept it the same as a man of any color saying it to you? And so conflict resolution becomes really important in how we determine people's actual ability to express themselves. If we expect civility, we've got to define civility. When we appeared here from the Power Shift Summit, before the EEOC's task force to talk about the work that we're doing, one of the task force members said, who gets to define civility? And it was a really good question. If we don't have a baseline discussion about treating people with human kindness and respect, we can start defining civility for one person different than another. How we allocate budgets can be affected by unconscious bias. And for all of us who are in journalism, content and coverage, our decisions about what's important, what's interesting, who cares, who's affected, how we frame concepts, whether we talk about something as a problem, whether we use the term racist or racially tinged to define something that's been said, all can be a factor influenced by unconscious bias. Number 3, be a learner, but don't presume anyone is obligated to be your teacher. This is a little tricky because just at the point of you as an ally wanting to be able to ask people, teach me, tell me, I don't want to make a mistake, the person you're asking may have had a lifetime of being asked those questions. You know, I'll tell you this, as a woman in the workplace since the 1970s, some of these stories get really old. Some of these lessons telling you over and over again when you hope society would have moved forward. But let's think about this. Allies, if you're humble, you need to be better informed. But it isn't just by picking the brains of a few people. So you read and view and listen to resources that help you understand current and historic patterns of bias, harassment, and discrimination. Start from a foundation of self-education, and there's plenty of literature out there. Journalists, if you want to pull out a book like The Race Beat, that won a Pulitzer Prize, that tells you about how journalism played a difference in the civil rights era, but journalism also was very flawed. And when you read that, you also read about systemic discrimination. Steep yourself in good reading, current and historic, so that you're not asking people to tell you things you ought to come to the party knowing already. You have to leave your comfort zones. If you are not a minority journalist, have you gone to a minority journalism convention where you are in the minority, where the topics aren't about your daily life, and in fact, they may be critical of the place that you lead? That's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to sit down with your own employees and say, how are we doing? Is there anything we should be doing better? And really listen for and do they feel even comfortable telling you? Real allies don't expect that others owe them guidance and coaching, and they respect the emotional labor that may be involved in providing it. A participant in one of our programs here said, "Your learning is my labor." Recently did a workshop, and I always ask people if they're comfortable to raise their hands if they have experienced harassment or discrimination. We just did one last week with about 100 people in the room. But you have to start out by saying you don't have to raise your hand if you're not comfortable, because even the act of asking about that could hurt someone who doesn't really want to publicly talk about it. I will tell you that in that room of nearly 100 people, the vast majority of the hands went up, having experienced harassment or discrimination. Now, we didn't ask them to tell their stories, and I guaranteed them at the beginning they wouldn't have to. That wasn't our purpose. But it was to establish in the room a baseline understanding that we're not talking about some vague, unknown problem, that in that room something has happened to almost every person here. Some of them are absolutely ready, willing, and able to tell you about it. For others, it's ripping open a scab that's barely healed. Do you have the emotional intelligence to know when and how to ask? Allies don't presume that traditionally underrepresented people, the people who are in the minority on your team, that they speak for anyone more than themselves, their experiences, their perspectives. However, the insights they provide could lead you to further learning. As we have done our listening tours on the Power Shift, people have said how offensive it is for someone to come up and say, "So, what do women think of this? What do Black women think of this?" Well, the answer is, I can tell you what I think of this, but don't expect me to be the shortcut for telling you everything about everyone, because it's just me. Go and do your learning using what I've told you as a start. Number 4, recognize the invisible work that is being done by your underrepresented employees. What do I mean by invisible work? Because when I work with emerging leaders programs, and these are programs, ASNE here in the United States, which is now becoming the News Leaders Association, Canadian Broadcasting, diverse emerging leaders programs there, we talk about this idea of invisible work. I tell the participants, don't do invisible work. I don't mean don't do the work, but don't let it be invisible. Make certain that your managers know what you are doing. Now, what do I mean by this invisible work? Here are a few examples. We ask you to join the Diversity Council. Then we ask you to help diversify a committee. And then, would you serve as a mentor? Because, gosh, we can get more people. We can recruit people if they know there are good mentors like you. And then, by the way, even when you're not a formal mentor, when you are in a minority in an organization, other people feel more comfortable if they see someone who looks and sounds like them, and they come to you, and they ask you for advice on navigating the system. And you're an informal resource, too. And then, could you help us recruit? Because that would really be good, and you know that's a positive thing for the organization. And could you go represent us in the community? And all the while we are asking you to do this, as a manager, we might be thinking, bet you think this is good. I bet you think this is proof that we're doing the right thing. And it is proof that we are trying to do the right thing, but it's also proof that we are giving you an extraordinary amount of extra work and emotional labor, and we expect you to do your day job too. And we evaluate you on your day job. Do we evaluate on the invisible work? That's why I tell journalists not to do work that they don't get recognition for. So they should be telling you, if you're a manager, but you should be respecting it and rewarding it when you do. And never make someone feel obligated to do any one of those things. But when you look at it as a tremendous asset to your organization, then that work cannot be invisible. Number 5, and I will tell you that when we did a huge listening session here at the Freedom Forum with the minority journalism organizations, they said repeatedly to talk about microaggressions and unconscious bias. So what do we mean by microaggressions? I worry, because language is powerful, that micro sounds tiny. right? Micro sounds like a small thing. I mean, this is aggression, right? This is aggression. It's a knife in your back or your front. But this is aggression too. Now imagine, if you will, those needles. And if you were at work and somebody, and maybe a couple of somebodies, maybe once a day, maybe not that often, but often enough, poked you with one of those needles, made you uncomfortable. How long would you want to stay in place? How long would you want to work with that person or with that team or for that boss? So what do we mean by all those little needles that add up over time? Here are a few common microaggressions. Using loaded or dated or demeaning language. You know, sometimes your youngest employees, for example, they feel completely left out when you're using cultural references, music and TV shows that you grew up with, that they have no idea what you're talking about, but you say that's the norm. Offering condescending praise. Your underrepresented staff are going to tell you about times that somebody looked surprised that they succeeded. Wow, you're so articulate, they will say to a person of color, as though that wasn't expected of them in the first place. Oh, for a young person, you're really catching on here. The qualification of telling you about your age. I must say, as a baby boomer, that we are terrible about comparing everything to ourselves. You know, when I was your age, I don't want to hear about your age. Their age is fine, thank you. Relating or relegating a team's social or note-taking or housekeeping tasks by gender. Ask the women in your office, in your team, how often they're the ones who are planning the social event, the birthday party, cleaning up the room after people leave, being asked to take notes or make a record of things. I worked for a wonderful boss who hired and promoted a lot of women in our organization. And when we had a department head meeting, and there were so many women in the room, in the executive conference room, he would get up and pour coffee for any outside guests that we had and then serve all of us. And he once whispered in my ear, I got to stop hiring so many women so I don't have to pour coffee for you all the time. But he did it on purpose. It was his joke, because he knew that if women were pouring the coffee, people would get the impression that that was our status, that was our real status. Do you pour the coffee for people? It's a small thing, but it's an important thing. What about focusing on looks before skill or talent? Again, this can be a generational difference, but many times someone will say to a woman on a panel, right? And now let's go to the loveliest member of this panel, when it's a panel of professionals. They will introduce people by their looks when they're women, instead of talking first about their talent. I find now that when I look at people, my friends' Facebook pages, and they put up a new picture of themselves, I always add, if I'm going to react to their new picture, it'll always say something like wise and wonderful, not just, wow, you look good or you look hot. Because telling people that they matter based on their looks is sending a totally wrong message. What about this? Interrupting, ignoring, and talking over others. This happens in workplaces a lot. Deborah Tannen, the researcher on men and women in the workplace, responded to this really well. She said the reason that many times a woman offers an idea in a meeting, and then later on a man repeats it, and people go, whoa, that's great, is that women in meetings tend to talk less because they want to look like they're good team players. So they may throw the idea out, and it doesn't really get hooked onto then. Now, it may be that people just don't take women seriously, but there's another reason. They may say it in a shorter amount of words, a lesser amount of words. And then the conversation goes on, and then a man says it with a little bit more depth around it, and people start to listen. But there's also interruption. Ask the women in your workplace what it is like. Ask the traditionally underrepresented people what it's like to feel like others talk over them. Remember, extroverts often think by talking, so they like to finish people's sentences. But when you're doing it for a person who doesn't feel that they have power, what you're saying is, it's okay, I've got this. You're not important. What about assuming a person lacks or has certain interests, skills, knowledge, ability, or disability? When you come into the conversation presuming that someone would like to cover a story like this because they're a woman or a person of color or a person with a disability, how do you know that? Making statements or asking questions that presume the questioner is normal and the other person is unusual. So, what is it about, and they're honest to goodness, have been women of color who've said, they've been asked questions like, so what is it about black hair? Well, it sounds like you're coming from a place of, I'm normal and you're weird. What is it about rap music? Frame your questions as honest questions. I don't know much about this. Could you help me understand? Asking highly personal questions related to gender identity, ethnicity, or disability. When I was previewing this presentation for an officer of the National Gay and Lesbian Journalists Association here in the United States, she sent me some examples. She talked to members of the association, and they said the stories they could tell you of people saying things like, you remind me of my brother, to a woman, or do you ever wear a dress, to a lesbian? Personal questions about their sex lives that you would never ask another person. Producing events or materials that exclude whole groups of people. There is a movement underway by a lot of men who want to be good allies to simply state, I will not be a part of an all-male panel. Now, people who organize programs often say, well, you know, I just want to get the best in that field. I want to make sure I get these experts. And, you know, we didn't have a real big budget. We couldn't fly people in. If you are intentional, you will make it happen. Just the way you'll make it happen in coverage of stories. Just the way you'll make it happen when you put a faculty together for a workshop. You'll make it happen. If you're intentional, you will make certain that the events you produce and the materials that you produce tell a story of inclusion. What about framing information and creating content through the lens of the race, ethnicity, gender identity, age, or physical ability of the dominant decision makers? Okay, I said that in pretty lofty words, but let me give you an example. The next time you see someone do a story on the news about wheelchair basketball, pay close attention. How much of the story, if it's produced by a person who doesn't use a wheelchair, how much of the story is about the wheelchair and how much of it is about the basketball? Because if you join a wheelchair league, you are a competitive athlete. And what you'd really like is somebody to talk about how well you're doing, not necessarily about the chair. But so often, if you're not in the chair, you can't imagine anything but that, and that's how you frame it. And so always taking a look at how we are framing a story, a conversation, a problem. You know, I was teaching and someone started the conversation by talking about the worries about men being discriminated against with false accusations in the Me Too movement. If that's the very first thing we're going to talk about, we are already framing the conversation as that being the most dominant theme, the biggest problem, when we know proportionately from our statistics on sexual assault and false accusations that they're minuscule. But we can start with the wrong frame. It doesn't mean we don't introduce the subject, we don't talk about it, just as we do here. But put it in its proportional place and don't make it be the frame. Misidentifying ethnicities. The feedback we received in our listening session from the South Asian Journalists Association, one anecdote was 2 South Asian journalists working in the same organization consistently misidentified by ethnicity, consistently being called by each other's names. What about people in your organization who mimic dialects or speech patterns and treat them as humorous? All you have to do is watch a couple of episodes of The Office and Michael Scott can teach you It's not funny. Repeatedly misidentifying colleagues or mispronouncing their names. It's a little tricky. You work in a big organization, somebody may have joined the team, you've only met them once or twice, they're in a different division. It can be challenging to go up to someone and say, I'm sorry, I know that we've seen each other in the hallways, but I don't think I know your name. And then listen when they tell you. Listen to the pronunciation. Repeat it, if you will, and say, I want to make sure I'm saying this right. When I teach a workshop that is multicultural, I will often say to someone at the very beginning of the workshop, please school me in the pronunciation of your name, because nothing's more important than the rest of us being able to properly say your name. And what about making physical contact out of curiosity or presumed consent? Ask pregnant women how they feel about near strangers coming up and putting their hands on a pregnant belly, or coworkers doing the same. It's one thing if I know you and I love you and that's okay with me, but it's not someone else's space. Ask women of color about the number of times, men and women of color, a number of times curious people have come up and touched their hair as though that space is okay to invade. So to qualify as an ally, now you're feeling like, oh my gosh, there's all these little things and I'm doing all the little pinpricks, right? Maybe you have done some of these. Maybe we all have done some of these. Maybe we've done them accidentally. I don't think you get up in the morning thinking, how am I going to make somebody's life hell? But let's think about what we can do if we have done or could do some of these. Just check our behaviors. Be a learner and a teacher. Explain the impact of aggressions to those who don't yet understand. Just help teach other people, especially your own colleagues. Take a stand against aggressions of all kinds when you witness them, and learn to have courageous conversations. Courageous conversations are the things that we have to have when we know something isn't right and we have to talk to somebody about it. And that is number 6. You've got to find your voice for courageous conversations. It's not easy. If you want to be an ally and speak up, you've got to be ready sometimes in the moment. And that's why, as you can see from the visuals we have here, that when we do our workplace integrity training for media organizations, we have an entire session on courageous conversations. You get a mini lesson right now. Courageous conversations are values-driven communication in the face of present or potential conflict. Meaning, you may be stepping in when something is going on right now, or by bringing something up, you know you're going to raise tension. You know, because how many of us like being criticized, right? If I'm being told that I'm doing something wrong, especially if I didn't intend to, and especially if what you've just told me makes me feel like you're calling me a racist or a sexist, when maybe you are, but more likely you're just trying to get me to change some behavior. So there may be some tension. So let's do a couple of case studies, okay? You're in a meeting to brainstorm a new project. Maria, a female colleague, makes a suggestion to which there's a little response. People around the table continue tossing out ideas, and then Joe, a male co-worker, offers a proposal that's essentially the same as Maria's, and the room starts buzzing with approval. So what do you do, aspiring ally? What do you say in that moment? You're worried, of course, that you're going to look like you're knocking somebody or becoming pontificating or a lecturer. Or you know all the ways you might do it wrong and why you're afraid of that. How do you do it right? Well, how about this? You speak up calmly and clearly in the moment. Hey, you know, when Maria suggested that, it really made a lot of sense. Glad to hear you agree, everybody. Maria, can you tell us more about your thinking? You're not indicting anybody. You're just making sure that you slide that attention, that spotlight, right back to the beginning. And by the way, as an ally, you come into these meetings with a little bit more of a fine-tuning for making sure that all voices are heard when they want to be heard, and you amplify people who may not be heard. And then after that, you look for patterns. Does this happen often on your team, and to whom does it happen? And you might make careful notes so you have specific examples. You can do this as the team leader. You can do it as a team member. If you see consistent interruptions or dismissal of some voices, discuss the problem with your boss. If it's not a one-off, if it's just not an anecdotal event, discuss it with the boss. And if you are the boss, address the issues with your team to change those dynamics. Another case study. You're at an after-work happy hour with a few of your teammates and a new intern. You see one of your coworkers repeatedly touch the intern, who backs away each time. Now your coworker is putting an arm around the intern's shoulders, and the intern looks very uncomfortable. What do, aspiring ally? Now, before I go to the answer, I want to point something out to you. I never used a pronoun in this case study. I just said, few of your teammates and a new intern. I said, one of your teammates put an arm around the intern. This is a little example of checking for unconscious bias. Because when I told the story, you had a mental picture of what was going on. Did you picture a man and a woman? Did you picture two women? Did you picture two men? We have an automatic framing that we do when we hear things. Now, it doesn't mean you're biased. I'm just using this as an example to tell you how easily we get mental models. So what do, aspiring ally? Well, this is where you move from observer to active bystander. I learned about active bystanders from my own students at Loyola University in Chicago, where they've actually taken training to know how to intervene when they're in a social situation, especially if alcohol is involved, and it looks as though one person is taking advantage of another. You are the one who intervenes. You are the one who steps in. But when you do, you need to protect that intern's dignity and agency. Because as an observer, you don't know exactly what's going on. And if you swoop in like Superman or Superwoman, it could be that the intern says, I didn't need that help. I could have done it myself. So you can walk over and say, hi, what's going on? You need to come over here and talk to me about this. You change the subject, you deflect. You kind of do the best read you can, but you still do it respecting that person's dignity and letting them tell you what they want to have happen. Assist with the intern's choices to stay and move elsewhere, to talk with you or others, or to have safe passage out. Don't assume you know what's best unless you are truly seeing, if you know CPR and the person needs CPR, do it, right? But there are a lot of things that are gray areas, and you don't want to look as though you're treating another person as though they are inept or incapable or helpless. You just want to be there to help in the best way they want from you. If the offending coworker pushes back at your intervention, de-escalate with straightforward language. I'm just here to help the intern. We can discuss this tomorrow. There is no need to raise the tension. Take it away. Be prepared to have a follow-up conversation about power and boundaries. And I will tell you, practice this. And then document and report. Because so many of these incidents, we don't want to make a big fuss. Now, we've said things should be proportional. We're not going to punish people because someone gave someone a wrong cue, was told to back off and stopped. Okay, that's the end of it. That's not necessarily a firing offense unless we find out that it is a consistent pattern, right? Unless it involves a lot more. But nonetheless, be prepared based on the seriousness or the continuation of these events to document and report. Okay, one more. You're on a hiring committee, and you worked hard to ensure that all the candidates are asked the same questions, because you really want to eliminate bias. Good for you. As your committee reviews the top contenders, one of your colleagues says of a female candidate, she just seems too ambitious. That could be a problem for us. What do, aspiring ally? It's the kind of thing you might hear in a conversation. I don't know, just something about her just didn't seem, made me uncomfortable. Seems a little ambitious. Remember that unconscious bias often causes the same action or condition to be seen differently across gender or ethnicity. Is ambition seen as more of a negative for a woman than for a man? For many years, I've done talks to women's groups, and I will ask them to introduce themselves at the beginning of the event by shaking hands with the person next to them and saying, "Hello, I'm a power-hungry woman." The room usually bursts out in laughter as they do it, but then I ask, why are we laughing? What is it that is this like funny laughter, or is this uncomfortable laughter? Because the whole idea of talking about power and ambition is often seen as a negative for women. Ask your colleague, what do you mean by that? Before you make assumptions. Maybe that colleague does know something. Maybe in the hallway that woman said, "I'm going to have your boss's job in 2 years." Well, maybe that struck you as something you think is not appropriate. But then explain that. Do a deeper dive into the research. Find out what ambition really means. Does that person really mean, I aspire to be that good that I could do that job? Or did you hear it as, I'm going to kind of undercut that person every way I can, and I don't care about your future, I care about mine? How did you hear it? If the response seems to demonstrate bias, be direct. I believe we may be judging this woman differently than we would a man. Let's just stick to the criteria we had in the job description. Values-driven communication in the face of present or potential conflict is hard work, and that's why we offer a tip sheet in our workplace integrity training. When you go into them, always be clear about your goal. And I always tell people, preserve the human dignity of the other person as a goal too. Calibrate your conversation to the seriousness of the issue. Don't come charging in with your hair on fire for something small, but still make it proportionate. Find a way to say to someone, as I did to someone the other day in front of a big group, you just said something that I don't think you really mean to say in the way you said it, because I know you're a good person. I just want to explain. Now, it took a little bit of guts because I knew the relationship might be challenged as a result of this, and he was a powerful person. But he had used a phrase that could be taken in multiple ways. And I found some other language for him, and he thanked me, and he became a model. In fact, in front of the group, he became a model of how to accept feedback like that. And by the way, I sent him a thank you note afterwards, because I do think that when someone has been called out, following up with them is really important. You need to enlist allies. If you're going to be an ally having a challenging conversation, if you're going to bring up a topic to your own team, you might want to talk to a few people beforehand so that they're ready to help you produce a little bandwagon effect by saying, yeah, that's a good idea. Prepare for your conversation. Do everything you can to know all of the facts you need before you talk. Know your own conflict style. You may be a person who so wants to be liked that you fold. You may be a person who so loves to win debates that anything the other person says will lead you into a continued and escalated confrontation. Use your emotional intelligence. Look at the world through the eyes of the other person and be empathetic, especially if you know it's a person who wasn't trying to be offensive, who may have a legitimate feeling that's legitimate to them, but is being expressed in a way that is harmful to others. Avoid hyperbolic language. Always, never, worst. Those are things that leave you open to someone saying, you've misstated, you are inaccurate. Call out behaviors instead of attitudes. He's telling someone, I think you have a bad attitude, or I think you have a negative attitude. They'll say, no, I don't. But if I say to you, when you do the following things, it causes the following things to happen and we can't have that, that's specific and measurable. Document and report. One of the things we know, especially as journalists, is the contemporaneous conversations, notes, reporting that was done even years ago by people who thought they were powerless, now turned out to be the stories, the building blocks of stories that showed systematic harassment and discrimination and misconduct. Number 7, challenge systems, practices, and assumptions that foster inequity. It's hard to believe that you work in an organization that has this river that flows through it, that carries with it some systems that can cause the very things that you want to be allied against. But it's easy to have them happen. For example, what does paying your dues mean in your organization? You know, times have changed. Some organizations used to require a certain number of years of experience before people were hired. And then the digital age came about and we needed a new skill set. Or data journalism came about and we needed a new skill set. And we began to accept people who had stronger skills and fewer years in the business. And we made that evolution in some ways, but we still may have not looked at everything about paying your dues. An organization told me that paying your dues for them, a newsroom, was you had to work in a small bureau before you could work in the main newsroom. Until they realized that they were not retaining people of color. And it was largely due to the fact that those bureaus were all in largely white areas. And if you were young, single, and white, working in a small town, put in your 2 years of dues there, maybe that was okay. But if you were young, single, a person of color, you couldn't even get a good haircut. And they realized that that could have been the least of it. There wasn't much of a social life. You might have experienced all of the conscious and unconscious bias that people face when they are the other and singled out. So they rethought what paying your dues meant. And it's really hard for people who have been in power for a long time to take their own story of how they paid their dues and set it apart, set it aside and say, that doesn't matter anymore. Including those who have said, listen, I went to the school of hard knocks. I had bosses who yelled and screamed at me, and look at how successful I am. So see, they should just be able to have a thick skin and take it. No. You may have survived it, but you didn't necessarily like it. You now in the rearview mirror don't see it as bad as it was. Who creates your job descriptions and hiring criteria? Do you use templates? Are the templates old? Have you rethought jobs so that they are more inclusive? If your team is diverse, do the traditionally underrepresented employees feel they actually have a voice in decision making? We've talked before about diversity and inclusion. Another description of it is diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being able to plan the party. And when you get to pick the venue and the menu, whether that's in news or whether that's in any organization, when you are actually deciding how a story is covered or how a story is framed or what's going to be on the agenda at the meeting, who's going to speak first and why, all of those things make a difference. Are your personnel policies and standards designed around compliance with the law or the integrity of the workplace? If we tell people don't do something because it's illegal, and we stop there, and we consider everything else to be what some people like to say is, just politically correct. What does politically correct mean? How about morally correct? How about saying it may not be illegal for me to make goofy jokes that hurt your feelings, but it may not be illegal for me to expect that I describe the world in terms of sports metaphors to a group of people who, frankly, don't play sports. That's not illegal, but am I a good manager? Have I made you feel comfortable? If my idea of telling you about great leaders is telling you about generals who fought wars, have I picked any others that resonate with something in your life, in your world, your experience? Is tradition creating exclusion? What do I mean by that? Well, here's a little something about challenging systems. I want you to meet Sade Carpenter. She's the deputy editor for food and dining at the Chicago Tribune. I was with Sade in a workshop a month ago, and Sade talked very passionately about the June special coverage that the Tribune did. This is the Facebook post. We're writing about Black food culture on Chicago's South Side. Here's why. It was a month-long dedication. Now, Sade will tell you that she lobbied to have this coverage, a month-long coverage of largely Black-owned restaurants on the South Side of Chicago. But you may notice that the word Black is capitalized in that headline. We'll talk about that. Because Sade wrote an essay to Chicago Tribune readers, and I'm going to give you a few excerpts. This month's focus is but one small step forward as we continue eating at and writing about restaurants on the South Side, as we continue to prioritize coverage that's inclusive and reflective of the diversity of our city. To give the Black South Side food culture the visibility and respect it deserves, we've also chosen to capitalize the B in Black during this month's coverage. It's part of the story. The Chicago Tribune follows Associated Press style, which, by the way, most newsrooms do, which instructs us to write Black as an adjective in lowercase letters. Many journalists have argued that the B should be capitalized, and I agree we should have the option to do so. Sade told me that it took her hours of conversations with actually supportive editors who said, well, I get what you're saying, but we've got a system here. It's a copy editing system. So in order to have that simple change made, they had to go through layers of conversations with people at different parts of the paper. So there would be consistency, at least on that section, and people wouldn't come in and change what she had tried to do. She went on to write, through this month's coverage, we have an opportunity to show respect to Chicago's Black community, a community that understandably distrusts mainstream media and hasn't always received fair, prominent coverage. It is our hope that this transparency will start a conversation with you, our readers, and within the Chicago Tribune newsroom, as well as others, as we question why we follow certain guidelines and consider the people who did and did not have a seat at the table when these rules were created. Who's the Sade in your organization, and how could you be an ally? Because I will tell you that it was a very successful month of coverage. She sent me letters that she had received from readers, and she's now advocating that the paper in its whole change its style book. Stay tuned. Number 8, measure what matters. How diverse is your staff? Do you really know? Will you really tell? What are the trends in recruitment, hiring, retention, and promotion? Do you really know? Will you really share? What do you know about employee engagement or the assessment of the culture in your organization? Remember what I told you at the beginning? Managers tend to have a rosier view of how things are. Now, let's be honest, it's because we know how hard we try. Whenever we know what our intentions are, we tend to give ourselves a little more credit. And many times we're not even as open and clear about our intentions as we would like to be. Later, a little later, we'll talk about with organizations who are being open about their intentions and the impact that it's having. How well do you know your audience? When we oftentimes make decisions, especially in journalism, assuming we know what our audience is, it could be that our audience is based on our gut, our own personal experience. Everybody we know is interested in something, but how well do we really know the audience? Do we know how to use metrics to support ideas and initiatives? Here's the good news. Metrics can surprise you. When you think you're doing the right thing just because it's the right thing, and then you discover that it's also good for business, let me tell you about that. Take a look at this photo up here. This is a June program that was done at the National Press Club, and the topic was the coverage of Nipsey Hussle's murder in Los Angeles. This is Erica Smith, an editor of the Los Angeles Times. This is Angel Jennings, a reporter who was on the forefront of covering the story. And this is Kimberly Adams of Marketplace, who was debriefing them. Here's what happened. Erica Smith, when this story broke, was brand new to the Los Angeles Times. She'd only been there a short amount of time. She got into work that day, and about 20 minutes later, that tragic story broke. She went to Twitter to look at the kind of traffic that was going on around that story. And she saw how much of the communication was around what Nipsey Hussle meant to the community. And that caused her to say, I know the kind of story we need to do. Yes, it's a murder story, it's a crime story, but it's a community story. So then Angel, who lives in the area in which this murder happened, had an editor who, as she said, I didn't have to waste a lot of time convincing my editor of the frame we ought to put around this story. She made it her job to make it easier for me. According to Angel, she was able to turn 3 deeply reported stories in 5 days. And she said it happened because she didn't have to spend any of her time debating and negotiating with her editor, who was just there to help take the copy in, make it look better, and get it positioned correctly online and in the paper. What they said, all the while, Erica kept her eye on traffic on the website. And she saw that Angel's story, her very first story, her community story, got more traffic that evening than the rest of the page had had for the day. And then Erica paid attention to more than that, subscriptions, because it's a paywall. And she was able to determine that they got new readers and they got more traffic because of the kind of storytelling that Angel and another writer named Garrett Kennedy did that focused on the life of this man. Yes, there was crime coverage, but there was much deeper coverage of the community. And here at the Newseum, when Ava DuVernay received one of the Free Spirit Awards this year, a little earlier, she stood up and dedicated it to Nipsey Hussle, who was a friend of hers and an inspiration, and whom many editors didn't know very well. And many of the editors at the LA Times wouldn't have known. But then she went on to say that her paper did a remarkable job. She said, I gasped when I looked at the coverage because I never expected to see it in my paper in my lifetime. And there you had an editor who was doing the right thing and using metrics to support her case. But there's more. Let's go to the USA Today. Auto shows. This guy over here, well, that's David Brinkerhoff, and he's the deputy money editor, and he oversees coverage of auto shows. And this is the consumer and tech editor, Michelle Maltais. And Michelle Maltais went to David in 2018 when he was new to the paper then, and she said, do you think we could cover the LA Auto Show without showing pictures of booth babes? You know what booth babes are, right? The people that they position at conventions, standing next to things they're trying to show off. And David's response to her was, I felt bad for not noticing that a year earlier. It was a system. The photographers would go, they'd take pictures, they'd send them back, they'd post them. This was 2017, not that way in 2018. And then he sent a note to staff that said, our goal is to show beautiful cars, not objectify women. He kept track of metrics all the while to demonstrate to anyone who would ask that the move resulted in excellent, even better traffic than the year before, and he shared those stats with the staff. And of course, this was USA Today's coverage of the 2019 Detroit Auto Show. This had been the year before David had made the change. Michelle is the person who spoke out. She had the courageous conversation. She brought up something. Somebody might have said, oh, for heaven's sakes, why are you being so whiny? It exists there at the convention. Why don't you, it's there, we take a picture, we put it on. We make editorial choices every day. She had an ally who listened, and doing the right thing should be reason enough, but he used metrics to reinforce the decision-making, and his boss sent me a note to tell me how supportive she was of his decision. Number 9, be more than a mentor, be a sponsor. Do you know the difference? A mentor gives advice. That's an important thing. A mentor, being a mentor requires time and attention. But a sponsor is something else. A sponsor is an advocate. Sponsorship requires time, attention, assessment, candid coaching, and a willingness to put one's reputation on the line to advance the career of another. That's hard work. Are you willing to put your name on the line? Now, I will tell you that the data says to us that men are more likely to be sponsors to other men. And it's important for us to recognize that being a mentor is only the start. Recently at one of my Emerging Leaders programs, one of the women, an African-American woman editor, said she was asked to help recruit a more diverse newsroom. She signed on to it. And then she said the very first time that she had an opening, that the paper had an opening, people started coming to her, like sort of side conversations. Hey, I've got a former employee I know of. Hey, we've got an intern that we really like. They were people advocating for others, and they weren't diverse. And she said, I thought we had a process we were going to follow here. I thought we were going to get a big pool. And these folks were coming in the side door trying to get a leg up for somebody that they cared about. They were being sponsors to people. Everyone needs a sponsor, right? Number 10, you gotta be more than an ally. You can be an amplifier. I echo your ideas and I make sure that you get credit. You can be an accomplice. That's somebody who's in on the planning when someone is trying to make a change, and it's a little risky. You know, Sade needed accomplices. She had a few. She had people who were ready to go in and say, I too believe that we ought to change the AP style book. You can be an active bystander who intervenes. You can be that advocate. Listen, learn, and take a stand. Let people know what you stand for, even if it's not in the middle of a problem. It's in an everyday conversation. Be an ally to the allies. I support others who step up. There's some literature that says that men sometimes can pay a penalty for being an ally, for sticking up for women, looking like they've taken a step away from the tribe. So recognize that if you see someone endeavoring to be an ally, back them up. Be an individual, and this is the most important, who expects neither credit nor profit for my efforts to qualify as an ally. Because in truth, all we are is doing the things that should have been done from the start. We're solving problems that we were a part of creating or sustaining or not seeing. And so we don't deserve credit, and we certainly shouldn't profit from it. But your team can, and your journalism can. And there is a, recap. So understand that power affects our perspectives. Recognize the realities and risks of unconscious bias. Be a learner, but don't assume anyone is obligated to be your teacher. Respect and reward the invisible work done by underrepresented employees. Understand the meaning and impact of microaggressions. Find your voice for courageous conversations. Challenge systems, patterns, and assumptions that foster inequity. Measure what matters. Be more than a mentor. Be a sponsor. And be more than an ally. And with that, one bonus tip, as Kathy Trost comes up, bring the workplace integrity curriculum to your organization via our PowerShift project, Train the Trainers workshops. Kathy, tell them about it.
So we've been talking a lot today about the importance of good training, and the PowerShift project's workplace integrity curriculum is just that. It's one-of-a-kind training designed to build stronger, healthier media organizations. It's got 3 important qualities that we've all heard are important today. It's custom designed for media organizations. It's both positive and interactive, and it creates the kind of conversations for staffers that they rarely have at work. Let's take a closer look at the workshops in action.
The Workplace Integrity Curriculum is custom designed for media organizations, not just for journalists, but for all media employees who want their workplaces to be environments free of harassment, discrimination, and incivility, but filled with opportunity, especially for those who've traditionally been denied it. That's Workplace Integrity. The 3-part course is interactive and lively. It respects the experience and expertise of the participants, whether seasoned veterans or student interns. It's built on 3 pillars: critical thinking, courageous conversations, and culture of respect and trust. During all 3 modules, staffers work in teams. They talk together, think out loud, and find the comfort to have the kind of conversations we just don't usually have at work. Each module has its own exercises, analyzing things we've heard or said at work for their accuracy, assumptions, bias, logic, and alternatives. Speaking up in challenging workplace situations, proactively and reactively, using practical case studies to role play and practice. Building a workplace culture of respect and trust by showing what it takes, the values, skills, tools, systems, and assumptions, and showing what each one looks like in everyday behaviors and choices. After each module, participants download their takeaways both for themselves and for their organization. They set personal goals, things they'll work on, who their allies will be, and how they'll measure success. And in the culture exercise, they use a matrix that spreads and shares responsibility for respect and trust across individuals, teams, and the company. With this foundation of their own ideas and solutions, they build workplace integrity. Environments free of harassment, discrimination, and incivility, but filled with opportunity, especially for those who've traditionally been denied it. The faces you've seen belong to the inaugural class of workplace integrity trainers, all of whom experience the training as they learn to deliver it back home. And because the workplace integrity curriculum was selected to receive a major grant from CBS, qualified organizations now send staff free of charge with subsidized travel to the PowerShift's Train the Trainer workshops for workplace integrity.
Since our workplace integrity workshops were launched just a year ago, more than 100 media leaders, reporters, staffers, and journalism educators have participated in our 2-day training workshop. We have 3 more workshops scheduled this year, and you can see the dates right here for the upcoming workshops in August at Santa Clara University in California, October at Loyola University Chicago, and November right back here at the Newseum. The really good news is this training, this really valuable training, is free of charge to qualified applicants. Thanks to a grant from CBS Corp, we can offer these workshops free of charge with travel subsidies to individuals in the news industry and related journalism educational organizations who can deliver the training in their own organizations or who would be committed to teaching the curriculum to other media organizations. Please apply now by going to powershiftproject.org and join a growing cadre of qualified trainers who are agents for positive change.